we're going to be talking about a lot of the different ways that Scrum can fail. So we'll be going through some of the specific pitfalls that I've gotten to witness. I've seen things like multiple POs, wrong hires, splitting up teams, team members not buying in, and that's just to name a few. This presentation has a lot of different subjects, but we're just kind of trying to see how much we get to, and we might end up doing a part 2 eventually. So first one we're going to talk about is multiple POs. And I've kind of ranked these in different levels of damage. Some of them are debilitating, stunting, and some of them are minor. But all of them are things that, when they add up, can determine whether or not you're going to have some success with Scrum. So multiple POs, you'll often be hearing things like, I worked on the ad project instead of the main one because he said so. I'm not working on this anymore, but tomorrow it's going to be our next big project. You're hearing multiple priorities all over the place, and that's because the PO's main job is to be the source of your priority. So as soon as you have a situation where you've got multiple people saying, well, I'm kind of a product owner, well, I'm kind of a product owner for this, you're basically surrendering the ability to distill your priorities. You're not going to be able to give the team a solid direction, which when we're doing a sprint, obviously that's your number one thing. You want everybody working towards one common goal, being able to manage themselves, which they can't do if there's multiple goals and multiple interpretations. Every stakeholder that you have in your process has their own idea of what's the top priority thing. If we work with security, you're going to hear about like, well, if we don't do this, this, and this, we could be audited for this, and that could be debilitating for the company. Well, you have another stakeholder that says, well, if we don't even build this thing at all, our company can't make money. That's an even bigger problem. Well, you need a product owner to be able to do that, right? And it all happens usually. The central thing that I end up hearing is there's that trust point of, well, we need to trust one person to be able to distill what is the priority for this team. What is the number? What's the number one priority? What's the number two? With all of these stakeholders, being taken in. The other thing that can make this happen too is I've seen quite a few companies that half the company is on the Agile bandwagon, half of it's not. And the one that's not, frequently, when they hear that there's a product owner that ultimately determines priority, that can be very threatening to their current role, especially if they don't see where they lie. One of the biggest faults in Scrum that I found systematically is that it doesn't oftentimes, from outside of the Scrum teams, provide a lot of direction as to how they're supposed to contribute, which is also what makes the PO role so integral. Is POs need to be able to, by themselves, work with all of those stakeholders, get their input, and make sure that they understand, what the team needs from them. So who's responsible for fixing? I think I just said it. The PO needs to work with the stakeholders to get the trust. As a PO, the number one thing that you need to be doing is working with stakeholders, getting their feedback, being able to work with one another, especially when you have two stakeholders saying this should be your number one, being able to explain to them, okay, let's get into a room and let's hash this out, but it's coming through my priority. The number one thing that goes in tandem with that, though, too, is that, yes, the PO is the one that needs to get everybody, or distill those priorities, but stakeholders also need to hold them accountable. It's the only way to kind of fix that trust relationship, is to believe that stakeholders aren't out of the process entirely. The worst thing for Scrum is when a stakeholder believes, I have nothing to do with this process anymore, and you guys are just kind of doing your own thing. So before I move on, any thoughts, any questions? All right.
Hang on. Megan has a question. Oh, sorry. So if you're on a team that's experiencing this, I guess I'm confused at how if there's multiple POs, how the PO is going to solve the problem if they all feel like they're the product owner.
Yeah, and that is a major problem when nobody's actually got the role. If you're in that situation, the next person in line to try and solve the problem is going to be your Scrum Master, because at that point, it's not so much an issue of this one person isn't being able to do their job, it's the organization not understanding Scrum enough to understand what a PO actually is to do. And a Scrum Master, you have two jobs. One is, basically to be the liaison of this is where the team is at, this is what the team's needing right now. The other role is to be the ambassador of Scrum, for your organization. When you hear that something is going on that is totally counter to Scrum, you point it out. You're going to end up having to kind of build a case for, look, we keep hearing these conflicting priorities and it's causing this. Being able to track those immediate things, and then to point those things out, you'll frequently be rebuffed. It'll be like, yeah, that's life. That's frequently the thing that you'll hear often. But when you're able to say, but if we do this, if we have one person that, and especially if you can point out this is an ideal person to be in this role, to have that alternative, that's frequently a very practical way to go about it to get somebody on board. Nobody likes being told no, stop, but they like hearing there's a way to get something better. And frequently that's going to fall on the Scrum Master to kind of build that case, especially to be able to say the team is running into this and this. It's because we got conflicting reports from these people. I think this person would be the best person to be able to say what the actual priority should have been, and to kind of go about it that way. But I think that's your best case scenario in those specific cases.
And who are you making that case to? Like all the people that are the product owner, or to your manager, or to the director?
I think it's going to depend on your situation, because if everybody is calling themselves a product owner, like as soon as they start complaining, like you need to be able to say, within that group, hey, this is the case. But it probably ends up being a case of they're going to tell you that, well, they heard from their director that they're doing this role, so you're probably going to have to escalate to at least one level up. That's the expectation, because the enforcement of that, back to that, stakeholders need to be able to hold that person accountable, is going to come, from that next level up. That's going to be, if that's a director, basically telling the other people who used to be product owners, hey, you're all stakeholders and you need to tell me, especially if this PO is not doing their job. So in the end, yeah, I'm going to say that most of the time you're going to have to at least go up one level to be able to say, hey, this is what your teams are going through. These priorities aren't getting addressed properly because we're getting conflicting messages. This is who I think can do it. But that's going to mean that, the accountability chain for this team is changing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And great questions, guys. These are fantastic and love it. Any other questions? Okay. And we will move on. All right, pitfalls. Wrong hires. This one can be debilitating. If it's caught early, not so much, but frequently when it gets to the point of being a subject like I'm talking about here, it's those really rough cases. You hear things like, can this person do it? Because they take too long. We're not going to meet our deadlines. You're hearing things like, let's try and fix it on the team again at retro. Again, it frequently becomes we need to work around this situation, or when we work on it, it's kind of repeated over and over. So why do these things become a problem, especially? This one is one of the ones that I consider to be kind of a systemic issue within Scrum. And it's partially because of the accountability we hold teams to. So oftentimes teams try to handle everything within the team, which is the absolute best case scenario. One of the cases, though, that I saw this happen and it really hurt the team in question, there just was nobody on the team that could bring the one person that was really floundering up to par. There was nobody who was a teacher, and or for that matter, able to say for themselves whether or not it was the person's skill set or circumstance what to do. Now, that's something that the team was going to end up needing some education on, but inherently they tried to handle it themselves and just didn't really, on a professional level, have those tools. Compounding this is that it's not uncommon for an Agile organization to expect the team to handle the failings of team members. The trouble is when these cases are extensive and beyond, just, oh, this person's just taking a little longer to ramp up. And when it's actually, no, this person just does not actually have the skill set that we need them to have, or their personality just doesn't work to the type of work that we do, to hit those points. So how does it usually happen? I mean, wrong hires happen for all kinds of reasons. The hiring process, especially in technical work, is always known for being tricky as heck. And normally, when we catch these things early, it can be not a big deal, depending on, your organization's processes, if you're doing like a 3-month grace period, so on and so forth. But circumstances can oftentimes hide the problems. Sometimes it's a matter of, there's all kinds of rapid team changes. The projects were easier for a while, and then we got into our bread and butter, and oh my gosh, it turned out that, their skill set could only handle the easiest work that we do. So the question is then, okay, we have this problem. We believe that this person cannot what they do. Who's responsible for fixing? So I put down that the leads, when applicable, are ultimately the ones that have to respond. And I'm talking like a disciplinary lead. If this is an engineer that can't do the easiest work, then an engineering lead needs to be able to come in and try and help them, get them up to speed, because ultimately that's what our leadership needs to be able to do. But also to start doing a true assessment of their abilities and to identify, is it maybe that it was actually a team issue, that this person just doesn't work within this team boundary, or is it truly that this is a wrong hire? If you're in a very Scrum organization where there are no leads, then you're going to have to kind of go into a little bit more of a team ownership setup of, the team's going to have to basically kind of make those acknowledgments and figure out what can they do. And in the end, your management's going to have to be able to trust the team to be able to acknowledge this person is not working, and we need to draw the line in the sand. So a lot of tough conversations in that setup. So obviously the fix, so to speak, is kind of straightforward, but it's either their job role needs to be adjusted if it's a matter of, well, this type of work doesn't work, but we do have somewhere else. Okay. But ultimately it's down to leadership needing to step in, whether that's, going through the process of a termination or a re-education, whatever that, needs to be for that person. Any questions, any thoughts? No? Okay. All right. This was a pitfall that I've gotten to see that I've even seen in very disastrous settings, splitting up the team. This team's full of rock stars. Let's spread that to the other teams. It sounds like a great idea to some, and unfortunately, it kind of misses the point of what Scrum achieves. So why is it a problem? So Scrum is all about making teams, capitalize on strengths, fire on all cylinders, by producing things rapidly and iterating on the team's processes. What most people don't realize if they're not really studying, like development or just team-based work, is the fact that teams lose much more of their speed based on how they work with one another than anyone's individual contribution. You want to see someone work as fast as humanly possible, make them the only person on a project. And, they stop for nothing. They don't need anything. But that's not the nature of any of the work that we do, is collaborative, because we work on things that scope is far too much for a single person. So that's why Scrum is so important, because we need to be able to fire on all cylinders, to be able to work with one another as, solidly as possible. So how do we get to this point of splitting up the team? There's always the temptation within our management to see a great team and then teams that aren't performing as well and think, well, if I take this team that is just full of rock stars, I'm going to make all of the teams just that much better by spreading them over, especially when that great team has chomped through all of their high priority work, and all of the high priority stuff's now on other teams. It seems like a great idea oftentimes, but obviously it fully misses the point sometimes. So who's responsible for fixing? Ultimately, this falls on a Scrum Master to be able to kind of make the case, to be able to speak for the fact that it's the team's processes that speed them up, and the fact that it's all about making the team work well together. I make the point here of teams should back them up on this, because I've also seen a case of a Scrum team did really well, and the team heard that, oh, we're going to be breaking you guys up to spread the wealth, and the team kind of went, oh, well, that's just how things go here. And the Scrum Master kind of ended up in a position of, I'm making a lone stand that not even my team is behind me for. And part of that is the Scrum Master needs to be able to explain to the team, hey, guys, if you don't back me up on this, I'm not going to be able to keep you guys together and to be able to, really show what we can do. So it requires a little bit of buy-in for that. So fixing it is just down to pointing out the processes that are enabling the team to the greater organization, with a primary focus on the distinction between the team's processes and what works for, say, another team, because there's always something that is individual to the team. That I've seen teams that they say, hey, we have the entire morning where no one can say anything outside of IM without leaving and going into a meeting room. Like, we need total focus, total quiet. And then you have other teams that say, no, if you see something, like, just talk to me right now. Like, I need to know things as soon as possible. And depending on the team, the nature of the work, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It's all individual to those teams. To be able to make that point to the greater organization, like, hey, this team is working well together because they figured out one another. They've got these processes that are working that won't work necessarily here and there. It's not necessarily going to work to just take those individuals and put them on other teams. The other thing that can be pointed out is the individual interactions that the team has. That this person works well with this person because they're both very quiet, or this person works well with this person because this person's quiet, and this person always asks them, hey, do you have something to say, which always gets them going. To emphasize those individual level mixings and pairings that work so well. And to be able to talk to about retro topics, like, hey, we're here because we did these exercises that got to these root causes. I mean, you end up kind of basically going over Scrum with them, to go over this, but it's ultimately, when you're getting to the point where they're talking about splitting up a team, kind of necessary, because they've obviously missed that point of we're here to make these individuals work as a solid team. So any thoughts, any questions?
Okay. I have a question. This is Megan at CUNA. And I was wondering, so then how would you recommend, like, we brought on a lot of new people recently, and we have some really, like, It takes a lot about new people. We brought on some really great new people recently, and we have varying levels of technology and complexity on things, and so without like mixing up a team that we have of people who are currently like super deep in all those technologies, how would you recommend that we train up individuals without changing the team or making a team of like 20 people?
Right. So that's team formation kind of makes it like splitting a team is sometimes necessary because of those situations where like, hey, you got to give the veteran we need a veteran on this team to explain that how, our tech works, how this and that works. So there's absolutely going to be those times where you definitely need to split up the team. The thing that I've liked seeing whenever that's come up has been especially trying to figure out, is there anybody on an existing team that would make a good Scrum Master to basically, like to kind of pioneer that new team. But yeah, I don't know if there's a magic formula for forming teams per se, but I will say that there's not really a way to get around the fact that like you're gonna send two teams into storming whenever you pull somebody off to be the veteran for a new team. The best thing that you can do is try and make those judgments. The best thing to avoid in this case is like don't whole hog split a well-performing team across the ether to make it work, because you're gonna lose your best performing team. The best thing that you can do is try and do as few changes as possible, like taking one member from a team to be the veteran on another team versus taking a veteran team that's heavily performing and then just split them throughout the entire company to where you lose all of the retro progress that they've made. Doing that a little bit at a time, it'll make the storming period shorter for their absence, because at least the lessons that they've learned from anybody who's still on the team still continue. But then you're still able to kind of get that that veteran on the new team. So small incremental team changes versus whole hog, just splitting up an entire team. So it's a great question.
No.
I'm curious with the people here, how big are your teams? Like, is there an average that you guys follow?
Ooh, yeah.
Three to 20.
3 to 40.
3 to 9.
Is that what I heard? Oh man. Yeah, there is a point too where splitting a team is necessary, right? Because the magic numbers of Scrum, supposedly originally was 5 to 9, and now they've lowered it down to say, oh, you can have a Scrum team of 3 and it still works. So there is something to be said for you do need kind of a good process when you get to that point of, wow, this is too big. And the one thing I'll add to this piece is when you're getting to that point of splitting teams, if possible, keep people together, because you need to be able to build on people's ability to capitalize on their interactions with one another up to that point. Every time you put people in a totally new situation, you lose everything that they've learned about the individuals that they've worked with, and that's the biggest speed increase that you see in teams is capitalization of knowing one another and how to work with each other. So, are there any other questions? All right. So pitfalls. Team members don't buy in. This can be very debilitating. It can happen for a variety of reasons. So Jerry won't do that, so why bother changing that? Why, or then why didn't you tell us? You know, betrayal of, you know, transparency that sometimes happens. So obviously it's a problem because this is a process where we all need to be able to wear that leadership hat, you know, at different times. You know, whether you're a team member, a scrum master, a product owner, you know, you gotta know when to, you know, basically exercise your knowledge, you know, exercise the sharing of your knowledge, you know, for everyone. So if you don't buy into the process, the entire team kind of ends up being held hostage, especially when it comes to, you know, like, hey, we're doing retros to get better. And if this person doesn't buy in, everybody, you know, kind of doubts, you know, whether or not this process is even going to work. You know, and this is a process that identifies problems. If somebody doesn't buy in, you're oftentimes missing out on a person's entire perspective, and you're also missing out on their ability to contribute to the fixes, you know, to anything that gets brought up. So a lot of the reasons that I've seen this happen, some of it is distrust that comes from before Scrum is even part of the process. A lot of times, you know, there's, you know, yeah, we're doing Scrum, but, you know, these guys are going to keep doing the same thing they've always been doing. So, you know, I'm not going to bother learning a new process or participating in this because they're just going to change it later. You know, it's hard to shake that organizational mistrust. It also can happen. I'm going to go backpedal just a little bit. It can also happen, you know, when you're having, you know, say like retros that go poorly. Retros where like you see people finger pointing and not productively, and people, you know, kind of look back at their retros and they're like, no, this was an ugly thing that didn't do me any good. You know, so why am I going to buy into this process that, you know, it is if anything scaring me? So who's responsible for fixing? Ultimately, especially early on, this is going to be a Scrum Master issue. Eventually, it needs to go beyond if you can't get somebody to buy in. But ultimately, like going into, you know, Scrum is all about being, you know, when you're the Scrum Master, you are the ambassador for Scrum. You're the one that you know, can be able to identify for them, you know, this is what the Scrum process is. This is why we do what we do, you know, and, you know, this is also how we can make things better. It's something that, you know, it's absolutely one of the biggest things the Scrum Master has to do is to kind of make sure that everybody is buying in. Fixing it, if it's down to just, you know, there's one or two individuals, you know, being a Scrum Master, you know, we always talk about, you know, Scrum Masters being a coach, and this is no exception, you know, to be able to coach the individuals, you know, like this is why, this is what I think you're going to get out of it, you know, to be able to kind of help that along and to kind of also do that on the team level. Sometimes it takes, you know, separate, you know, pulling somebody aside and, you know, going, hey, look, you're holding this team hostage. You know, I don't know if you realize that, you know, to be able to explain that to them. And also to keep a dissonant voice from being the only voice. I've seen a couple of teams where, you know, they had that loud person that just dominated every conversation. And as a Scrum Master, you got to know when to put the kibosh on. You know, you want to hear things, but you need to also ensure that, like, if you have that dissonant voice that is just always harping and not in a productive manner, that, hey, you've had your time. We need to hear from everybody else. You know, or depending on, you know, the nature of, you know, what they're saying, it also might be that is not okay. This is supposed to be a safe space, you know, to talk about the problems that we have. You are not engaging that in a safe way. Until you can do that, you need to be done. Any questions about this one? right. There is one thing that I want to recommend before moving on, and that is the number one. This was something that I ended up finding out from a Scrum coach that we brought in. The number one method of kind of like avoiding this scenario is always make sure that one change that's been suggested in a retro happens between retros. So if you get 3 retro items, your first retro, you're doing at least one of them in the 2 weeks or however long your sprint is. By the time that the next retro shows up, it gives that obvious evidence that Scrum is doing something for your team. And that was the coach that had come in at his was apparently a survey that his organization that had done, that basically that was the most common denominator of did Scrum work in your organization or not. That was the most pivotal item that determined if it was successful. I will also throw out there that they're talking about the team splitting scenario. I have seen some cases where the buy-in level was low, and having members that know Scrum added to the team was able to kind of help out with that. I had a scenario where my team had to get split up because I personally was a Scrum Master, product owner, and a product owner for another team. So that team had to get split up due to that. We ended up taking 2 of the members that we knew were very, very strong Scrum people, putting them on to a team that was having an issue with buy-in. And they basically were able to, A, talk about the things that worked in the previous team, which helped. And B, we're able to add, another louder voice to the scenario. It's not an option, that should normally be on the table, but if you end up in a situation where, hey, this happens to be happening as well, that this team needs to move this member or something, it's one way to kind of take care of that as well. So, stakeholders don't buy in. So it's kind of related to the PO situation, but it can happen even when you have a single PO. So why do we keep having to do X? It never helps. Why do we just sprint planned yesterday and now you're throwing this at us? Those are all things that you hear all too often. So it's a problem because team members your team will lose buy-in because it sets bad precedent when stakeholders are kind of going off and doing their own thing, whether that's going to team members and expecting them to drop what they're doing, to do something for them. It also can be bad in terms of like you have a sprint set up and you're having to throw it all out. Projects, oftentimes, if you're not having a stakeholder buy-in enough to be able to give you everything that you need, a lot of times the project just goes awry because the expectations weren't practical. To not have their buy-in to give you that information, it can totally throw everything out of whack. Ultimately, it's all about, it creates waste. Anytime that you have somebody, interacting with a process that they don't understand or don't care about, you're talking all kinds of project changes, meetings, documentation, everything under the sun that is required to get them what they think they need when the team needs to be able to hit its priorities. So how does it happen? Sometimes managers' past success limits their desire to try new methods. If you have gone to being a Scrum organization, but your director comes from a non-Scrum background and has no interest in it, they probably aren't going to care how you guys want to run, because they're going to tell you how they did it and expect that that's enough. Ultimately, though, if you're running Scrum, you need Scrum level buy-in. And most of the time, it's just down to a lack of general understanding of the process. One thing I do want to add to this that I ran into more recently was concern over one's role in the process. sometimes you'll have stakeholders that the reason that they don't buy in is they don't see where they fit in the picture. And oftentimes it's the reason that they're going around because they see themselves becoming useless if they're not involved in the day-to-day, when they don't realize that like they are actually inhibiting, even their own goals by doing things outside of the Scrum process. So who's responsible for fixing? So number one is, POs need to work with their stakeholders directly. And Scrum Masters need to work with the team to kind of minimize the damage. That's, a Scrum Master needs to be able to, go up to the team and say, hey, I know that you just had, somebody drop by your desk and, say that they needed this. But if you don't tell the team about it, and especially your product owner, like we can't address it. We can't, handle it very well. And the PO needs to be able to, rope in a stakeholder and go, hey, that thing that you did, either maybe it was helpful. But if they're going, around the process, it probably isn't. And to be able to explain the situation, explain the goals of the team, and to be able to kind of get that buy-off from that stakeholder of, hey, that thing you want, we'll put it in our backlog, we'll get it done, but we have these things that need to get done first. So, fixing it, retros are a great time to talk about the problems and the causes, and oftentimes it kind of becomes a great point, for Scrum Master and PO to kind of build their cases for, it's one thing to say, oh, you're not supposed to talk to the team, but to be able to explain why and to be able to give a concrete example as to, hey, look, if you go straight to the team on this without going through anybody, that is involved in the prioritization of projects, you're causing this heartache, this waste. To be able to get into those specifics and then to be able to tell them, but if you talk to the PO, there's going to be times where something happens in the middle of a sprint that it is indeed, higher priority than anything that is being worked on at the time. That does happen, but if the stakeholder goes around the PO to get that done, they can throw the entire process out of whack and there's just waste because you have a PO that oftentimes is going, why are you doing this? You need to do this. Stop doing that. You have conflict, in priority because not everybody's working off the same information, which is the PO's job to basically distill. Scrum Masters, it becomes an opportunity to educate stakeholders in the process. If you've got somebody, that has no idea what Scrum is, if it's a director, if it's, a CEO, this is a great time for them to find out, like this is the process that, we're using and this is why. Being a Scrum Master, your job is, to be that ambassador for, this process that your team is using. So it can be a good point to be able to, effectively go over it with them, and it might be that the PO and the Scrum Master both need to be there to say, hey, look, I'm here, to be the person, to kind of help with the prioritization. And this guy's going to basically tell you, these are the reasons why. To kind of tag team it. Another point. Any questions? Any thoughts? All right. So this one's one of my favorites. Product owner as the driver. This one is, in my opinion, debilitating because it really flounders Scrum teams' buy-in. It's fine, we'll add it to the sprint, but it's not actually going to happen. You see that sometimes where it's like, well, you decided that it's going to be there, but I've already told you the reality. Or you hear the product owner saying, that's not enough work, you're sitting on your hands. So why is it a problem? It's obviously incredibly demoralizing whenever a product owner, does anything of this nature. Product owners inherently don't need to know how the work gets done. Product owners need to know what the work is, what the product is, and what its value is, so that the teams can get that prioritized workload. When you have somebody that, their expertise is not supposed to be how the work gets done, how the sausage is made, so to speak, deciding when the work needs to be done, then you're absolutely going to see demoralization, because you're using a process where people are supposed to become experts at what they do, to understand their process and to be able to figure out what kind of time things truly make. And then you have somebody coming in and saying, I don't care, or this is when you need to have it done. One of the key benefits also gets lost in that, Scrum is one of the few processes that by design puts somebody with the business background in the room with the people with the development background, and to create that inherent trust between the two. That trust that I'm telling my product owner that this can't get done in that timeline because it's true, and we're going to set ourselves up for poor expectations, or we're going to get into a crunch situation, or we're going to end up with a lower quality product because we need to just get this out the door, and we're taking on this risk. The Scrum inherently is meant to kind of allow for that trust, and making the PO responsible as a driver for how the work gets done effectively by saying what date something should be able to be expected. It is debilitating. And it often comes down to, POs getting tasked with, here's your dates, hell or high water, regardless of, where the development sits, where, actually having a developer be able to tell you when they can actually get it done. It often happens too when you have product owners that come from traditional management. And that's, a lot of it is, kind of that letting go, and it's something that happens very frequently. This is one of the most frequent pitfalls that I see, is POs becoming drivers because they come from that management background where they're expected to drive the work. So who's responsible for fixing? So Scrum Master and their team, they need to be able to call out that behavior. To be able to, as a Scrum Master, again, Scrum Masters are ambassadors for the Scrum process, to be able to explain, hey, we're not telling you this for no reason, but you're totally violating that trust. And then to be able to explain, you need to be able to trust us so that we can make you look good in this situation, to have those realistic time expectations, when these things are going to be able to be developed. It's just usually down to not understanding where the PO sits in the Scrum paradigm. So how is it fixed? Retros are pretty much the time to have the talk. The look, you're doing this because, your job is to make sure that, the best work is getting done, and, you're being told these dates, but what you're doing is harmful. And this is what, we're trying to avoid, to be able to talk about, look, we're trying to make sure that we're giving you realistic time frames, that we're not just, blowing smoke to try and get you to be okay, happy with what you're hearing. Sometimes it requires pulling in stakeholders, because part of the problem oftentimes ends up being that the product owner says, well, I've got this person telling me that I need to ensure these dates. And oftentimes it means, okay, next retro, let's bring that stakeholder in. Let's make sure that they understand the impact of the behavior they're expecting out of the product owner. Because oftentimes it's not just the product owner comes from a management background, or comes from a background where that's, the expectations that they are the driver. Sometimes it's the person above them. So retros are a great time to be able to have those conversations, and to be able to give perspective to a stakeholder. This is the impact of, what you're expecting, and this is what we're trying to do. To be able to explain to a stakeholder, look, we're not trying to sandbag. We're not trying to, sit on our hands. We're trying to get as much work done reliably and predictably as possible, so that we actually have true expectations for what will come from this team. So, any questions? Any thoughts?
John, it is 12:52.
Oh,
I didn't give you enough warning. Sorry.
Well, I warned you. I talk. Yeah. If you guys want, do you guys have any thoughts or questions on this one? After that, we'll wrap up. All right. Well, with that, I think we're done.